Welcome back to Creation Magazine Live. So in this segment we are talking about fossils.
We're actually
right?
Well, we're talking about a quote, actually.
Fossils that aren't
fossils.
there.
Yeah, fossils that aren't there.
Supposed
so are
to
they
be
really
there,
fossils?
but they're not there.
This was from Creation Magazine, volume 29, issue number 1. And it's about a very famous quote, actually. And then Gary Bates, who wrote it, he said that quote about the missing transitional fossils. So first we have to understand what a transitional fossil is. That would be, evolutionists say that, you know, we start with this creature and it evolves and it becomes more sophisticated or different anyway, and it turns into something else, and something else, and something else. And they do believe overall that simple things became more complex. And so if we find this creature here in the fossil record, and then we find this creature in the fossil record, and this one's different from this, where are all the missing links, the transitional fossils, the things that are becoming less like this and more like this along the gradient? And if you think about it, there should have been a lot more of those missing things than what we actually find in the fossil record, right?
Well, it should be difficult to classify creatures at all, right? It should be just a gradient.
That's right. It should just be, yeah, that's right. It would be like taking a gradient of a color or something, and yeah,
right.
Same thing. So there was a famous quote. So let's look into this. Anyone reading creationist literature for a few years soon becomes aware that we often use quotes by evolutionists which discredit their own belief system.
Sure.
This raises the ire of many in the evolutionary establishment, and often they will accuse creationists of taking the remarks out of context. This is rarely the case. However, one can imagine that the specter of condemnation from fellow evolutionists would these days tend to limit any careless remarks from the pro-evolutionary camp. They're being more careful about what they're saying because they don't want us to use it against them. One of the most famous and widely circulated quotes was made a couple of decades ago by the late Dr. Colin Patterson, who was at the time the senior paleontologist, which is a fossil expert, at the prestigious British Museum of Natural History. So he's one of the head dudes, we'll put it that way.
Sure, yeah.
So damning was the quote about the scarcity of transitional fossils, the in-between kinds, anticipated by evolution in the fossil record, that one anti-creationist took it upon himself to right the creationist wrongs. He wrote what was intended to be a major essay showing how we had misquoted Dr. Patterson. This accusation still appears occasionally in anti-creationist circles, so it's worth revisiting in some detail. Dr. Patterson had written a book for the British Museum simply called Evolution. Creationists Luther Sutherland wrote to Dr. Patterson inquiring why he had not shown one single photograph of a transitional fossil in the book. Patterson then wrote back with the following amazing confession, which was reproduced in its entirety in Sutherland's book, Darwin's Enigma. Patterson said, "I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. You suggest that an artist should be used to visualize such transformations, but where would he get the information from? I could not honestly provide it, and if I were to leave it to an artistic license, would that not mislead the reader?" He went on to say, yet Gould, Stephen Jay Gould, the now deceased professor of paleontology from Harvard, very famous evolutionist, and the American Museum people are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. You say that I should at least show a photo of the fossil from which each type of organism was derived. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. Well, that's why it's such a famous quote. I mean, here's an evolutionist admitting forthrightly that we don't have the transitional forms that should be there,
right.
Or there should be an abundance of them, and he says there's not one watertight argument for it. So this is why creationists used it, and fairly, as you can see.
Yes, and a man of great reputation, not just any
right.
evolutionist, but you know.
Right. So an anti-creationist tries to minimize the damage. Here's the next portion. The anti-creationist skeptic mentioned earlier wrote to Patterson asking for clarification about the comments in Sutherland's book. Patterson replied that the quote was accurate in its reproduction, but its interpretation was faulty because he had also written, "The reason is that statements about ancestry and descent are not applicable in the fossil record. Is Archaeopteryx the ancestor of all birds? Perhaps yes, perhaps no. There's no way of answering the question." Well, precisely. So why have evolutionist textbooks almost universally and dogmatically declared Archaeopteryx to be an obvious transitional form? So here he's saying, well, yeah, they quoted me correctly, but they're misinterpreting it because there is no way to determine what is a transitional fossil. Well, the point we're making is that evolutionists say there are transitional fossils, and they make those statements all the time.
Right.
But the issue goes deeper. Patterson's revision seems to be claiming, or at least the way the skeptic tried to highlight it, that all he meant was, the original quote was that it's impossible to determine whether any candidate fossils actually were real transitional ones, not that there was a scarcity or absence of in-between forms in the fossil record. In other words, they might look like missing links, but how could one know for sure? Well, now you're really messing up the waters here. However, to say that this was all he was saying is really impossible to square with the words of the quote itself. Note, for example, how Patterson referred to comments by Stephen Jay Gould and the American Museum people, who are well known to have specifically admitted the rarity of transitional forms in this fossil record. They actually proposed a theory of evolution in jumps to explain away the fact that the links seem to be absent. Gould even said in another place that the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only on the tips and nodes of their branches. In any local area, a species did not arise gradually by the gradual transformation of its ancestors. It appears all at once and fully formed. This is what Gould kept saying. So if one rereads the original Patterson quote, it is clear that it is perfectly legitimate to use it to highlight this extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record. Otherwise, the reference to Gould is meaningless. Right? Why would he have included it? Note that Gould, etc., were committed evolutionists, even interpreting the record through evolutionary eyes. They admitted that it was extremely rare to find transitional forms, not that it was impossible in principle. Creationists would, of course, claim that there are none except within a created kind. But even candidates for transitional forms are clearly so rare that Patterson was able to refer to Gould, etc., as saying there were, for all practical purposes, no transitional fossils. Yet a straightforward understanding of neo-Darwinism would suggest that there were many more transitional forms than the N forms we see today. So one would expect transitional fossils to dominate the record. Right? The context of Sutherland's letter to Patterson also needs to be remembered. He was simply asking why Patterson didn't even show one single picture of any proposed transitional form anywhere in the book. Patterson's reply made it abundantly clear that if he did, it would be storytelling, not science. Right? And it's nothing observable.
Right.
In fact, he went on to say in his original letter to Sunderland, it is easy enough to make up stories of how one form gave rise to another, and to find reasons why the stages should be favored by natural selection. But such stories are not part of science, for there's no way of putting them to test. Now, very interesting, later in life, Dr. Patterson actually gave a lecture to some evolutionists later on. You know, that's enough of this quote here. But look what he said about this topic. He started his talk, he said, talking about the topic of evolution. I'm speaking on two subjects, evolutionism and creationism, and I believe it's true to say that I know nothing whatever about either. One of the reasons I started taking this anti-evolutionary view, later on he became anti-evolutionary, well, let's call it non-evolutionary, was last year I had a sudden realization. One morning I woke up and it struck me that I've been working on this stuff, evolution, for 20 years, and there was not one thing I knew about it. That was quite a shock that one could be misled for so long. I've tried putting a simple question to various people and groups of people. Can you tell me anything you know about evolution? Any one thing that you think is true? I tried that question on the geological staff in the Field Museum of Natural History, and he got one response. Yes, I do know one thing. It ought not to be taught in high school.
Amazing stuff. Wow. And so many other more information with other issues of Creation Magazine and on creation.com.